In the early years of my ministry, I tacked an essay to the wall behind my desk at the Second Presbyterian Church in Indianapolis by Tom Long, who will be a guest here preaching in the spring, entitled, "I Believe in the Not So Holy, Not Quite Catholic Church." I kept it for a long time, but eventually I had looked at it so long that it was no longer fresh to me. I lost interest and shuffled it off into one side in a folder and eventually relegated it to a desk drawer and forgot about it, as one does. I recovered it when I was unpacking boxes here in my office at First Church, and I remembered why I had kept this particular essay so long. In his essay, Dr. Long speaks of the reality of a plethora of competing claims about faith. He begins with the words, "I love thy church, O Lord," goes the old hymn, but there are a number of reasons nowadays to reconsider our passion. Everybody knows the church has its problems. The terrifying bungee jump plummet in mainline membership, the aggressive theological parties rumbling around the ecclesial hood like the sharks and jets, the OK Corral mentality of general assemblies, the crisis in ministerial leadership, the disenchantment list, he says, goes on. Tom wrote that in 2000. Since then, the only thing that has changed is that the theological gangs no longer seem to dominate our national assemblies. Well, not at least since the church voted to recognize that God can, in fact, call LGBTQ persons to ministry, and those who couldn't live with that decision decided they couldn't stay in community, which is a whole lot like saying they got mad, took their ball, and went home. But the end result is now our assemblies are much more peaceful places. They are, at worst, dominated by controversies about how we invest our money instead of the validity of God's people. But of course, Tom didn't write that essay in order to be unhopeful. He wrote it to give a hopeful word to the church, and so in doing so, he highlighted a number of new ministries that he had observed around that time period. One notably called Theology on Tap, a ministry of the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. They began it to attract Gen Xers to church through a famous local watering hole named Lulu's. Now, every few years, the greater church gets panicky about how to attract the next subsequent generation to church. This is an age-old pattern. We started off worrying about how to get the boomers involved in church and keep them involved in church. Then we moved on to the busters and how to retain them. Then after that, the Gen X came along, and following that, the millennials. And I'll just update your language right now, by the way. The millennials are no longer the youngest adult generation in church. So we've stopped worrying about the millennials now. Sorry, guys, you're passé. It's all about Gen Z now. It's as though the church, generation after generation, seeks to stave off some sort of Presbyterian rumspringa, only to find that in the final estimation, it is in fact the body of faith itself that brings our members home. Is it any wonder then that Dr. Long went on to write that his comfort came not from any program of the church, but from the sacrament of baptism? He writes, "Not long ago there was a baptism of a baby in the little church where I worship. I watched from the pews as the young parents holding their child took their places at the front of the church for the ceremony. Mostly, it was the father who caught my attention that morning because I was struck by the differences between us. There he was, barely out of high school, wearing black jeans, a t-shirt, and a couple of tattoos. He had more body parts pierced by metal than a getaway car and a mob hit. There I was, middle-aged, coat and tie, not a tongue stud or nose ring to be seen. We'd hailed from different generations, followed different lifestyles, maybe came from different planets. If he had found me at Lulu's, undoubtedly he would have slid to the other end of the bar. Nothing in common. But there we were in worship together. He pledging to raise his newborn son in the faith of Jesus Christ, and me standing up to promise that I would help him. And both of us somehow meaning it. There is something about how the sacraments help us to do just that, to come together in community, whether it be by promising, as we do, to each person baptized in the faith, to help them to grow in the knowledge and service of Jesus Christ their whole lives long. Or perhaps it is the fact of the inherent democracy of the communion table. You know, no matter who you are, or where you come from, or what you have done in your life, there is a place at this table set for you by God. The church doesn't set the places at the table, God does. We just recognize what God has already done. I suspect sometimes that for many of us, I know it's true for me, when the sacraments are celebrated at table or at font, we recognize that we are in the presence of a thin space between heaven and earth, where we recognize somehow more fully the promises of God. We're always aware of them, but they're somehow more present to us in those sacramental moments between me and the entre nous, as it were. For a split second, over in the blink of an eye, we're somehow closer to one another and to God. Why do we baptize children and adults into this life of generosity and kindness and praise? We're certainly not making their lives easier by suggesting they follow Jesus Christ. So why do we do it? Why do we return to this joyful feast of the Lord with all of its claim on our lives? Nourishment not simply for the sake of nourishing us so that we may sit back and feel blessed, but nourishment so that we might in turn be a blessing to everyone whom we encounter. Why do we come back over and over to the table of Jesus Christ? I think we do it because we know that when we do, we are participating in covenant community. On days such as this, when we pause in worship to give thanks to God for those who have gone before us, indeed, to give particular thanks to God for those whose loss from our lives is all the more acute, how important it is to know that we belong to God. In their wonderful book, Belonging to God, David Willis and William Plaker wrote, "In life and in death we belong to God." That's ripped straight from the Catechism. Instead of being alienated from God, and instead of being strangers and aliens to the promises, we are adopted, brought into, made part of the household of God. freed to participate in life together in Jesus Christ. That is the same language that we encounter in the letter to the Ephesians. The letter tells us that we have been chosen from the foundation of the world to be holy and blameless. And I don't know about you, but some days I just don't feel particularly holy or blameless. I mean, I don't think I'm anything other than a garden variety sinner, mind you, but I am aware of my flaws. They are legion, and don't get too comfortable. I am aware of some of your flaws as well. And yet, even still, the author of the letter to the Ephesians tells us that God has chosen us from the foundation of the world to be holy and blameless. How is that even possible? It's all in how things are seen. Humorist David Sedaris describes the experience of his mother finding in his younger brother's room, his younger brother being the baby of the family, a skull-shaped smoking apparatus. Rather than hitting the roof, she put some flowers into the thing and commented, "What an unusual vase your brother Paul has. He's so creative," and placed it on the dining room table. It's all in how you see things, isn't it? In Jesus Christ, God has chosen how to see us: holy and blameless. Rather than seeing us at our most flawed, sinful, difficult, duplicitous, pernicious, avaricious, and frankly at times ridiculous, God chooses how to see us. And God sees us like Jesus Christ. Can you imagine such a thing? God sees us as if we are Jesus Christ. And God will never look at us any other way. Because God has chosen to be that way toward you and me from the foundation of the world. The letter to the Ephesians tells us that God adopts us in Jesus Christ. Did you know in the ancient Near East, if you adopted a child, your obligations to that child were actually greater than if you birthed that child yourself? God adopted us in Jesus Christ. And what do we get for that? Well, the letter to the Ephesians tells us we get redemption. We get forgiveness of our sins. We get an ingathering to God. They call that an inheritance. And what is the inheritance that we receive? We are chosen to praise. What an odd inheritance that might seem to be. I do understand that the vocation of praise can seem a bit odd at times, suspect even. One of my favorite old Far Side cartoons is one of the split panel ones. On the upper panel, there's a scene of St. Peter standing by the pearly gates, and as the soul to be admitted comes in, he says to him, "Welcome to heaven, here's your harp." And on the lower panel, there are stalactites and flames, and a devil greets the soul to be admitted and says, "Welcome to hell, here's your accordion." Or it could be a bagpipe. Take your pick. Any instrument that folks don't like. Praise is not sitting around on clouds with harps. Praise is a way of being oriented in the knowledge of our Creator, grounded in the reality of redemption, sustained by the knowledge that we have received the forgiveness of sins. It is an existence marked by knowing our place in creation as the crowning of God's creation. Now I get, even with all of that, it may be that the idea of praise still strikes us as a little bit of a mystery. Why praise after all? The Westminster Catechism has an answer for that. It tells us that the chief end of humankind is to glorify God and enjoy God forever. That's praise. That is worship. Praise allows us to know who we are, and perhaps more importantly at times, to know who we are not. And worship is the means by which we articulate that awareness. You see, to praise is to be human. It is to be reminded that there is an eternal and that we're not it. It's to be reminded that there is a Redeemer and we're not it. It's to be reminded that we are chosen from the foundation of the world to be seen as holy and blameless in the sight of God. What worship does is to remind us of those foundational realities in which we live. Praise gives us the context for redemption. Praise gives us the language for forgiveness. Praise gives us the assurance of being gathered in as God's very own. It is in this last way that we perhaps see our vocation as the church, being the body of Jesus Christ. And it is in this last sense, as the gathered body of Christ, that praise grounds us. It gives us our knowledge of the place in the world as God's beloved community, as God's people entrusted with a message of kindness and generosity. Praise, knowing who we are, grounds us in the reality that we have been chosen before the foundation of the world, with all that that means. Every time I think of what it means to belong to God, to be chosen, I come again and again back to an old story, a favorite of mine by the essayist Anne Lamott. I don't think I've shared it with you before, but in case I have, I'll just apologize and tell you I'm going to tell it again, and I'll probably tell it 3 or 4 more times as time bears on, because it captures something I think very important. Anne Lamott tells a story about a little girl who got separated from her parents on one morning in a neighborhood, a city neighborhood, not unlike where we live here. And as she wandered off, it's so easy, children do that, they're slippery. They just sort of wander off, and we do our best to hang on to them, and if we're lucky, we do, and occasionally they wander off, and we chase them down, we get them, and we bring them back. But this little girl had managed to get beyond the chasing down stage. She was far afield, and so she was walking down this city street. She was obviously in distress, and so a police officer, seeing her, stopped his car and got out and walked over to her and said, "Little girl, what's the matter? What's wrong?" And he was able to figure out pretty quickly that she was lost. So he said, well, who are your mom and dad? The little girl couldn't remember her mom and dad's name, or maybe she just knew they were mom and dad, which is not exactly all that helpful to the police officer. So he said, well, where do you live? And she didn't know her address either. But the intrepid police officer, thinking this through, realized that this little girl couldn't have possibly gotten that far on foot. She had to be from somewhere around where they were. So he had the bright idea to invite her to get into the back of his squad car, and he would drive around slowly, and she would look out the window and look for her mother or father or her house or some means of recognition. And so that's what they did. The little girl got in the back of the squad car, and they started driving around, and nothing. She didn't see anything she recognized, no people, she didn't see her house. And so the officer began to become very concerned, but he kept on driving. And then he noticed there was a moment when calm flooded through the little girl's face. And she said, "It's okay. You can let me out now. I see the steeple of my church, and I know the way home from here." That's what it means to be adopted in Jesus Christ. That's what it means to belong. It is to know the way home from here.